Well, welcome. It is chapter 22 of Matthew tonight that we will dive into, but I wanted to start with because we've had a little bit of time off for the summer break and we're kind of reconvening. Plus, we're in the middle here. We find ourselves in the middle of a larger conversation, and I wanted to just remind you of what that conversation is, because it would be very tempting to dive into this first parable in chapter 22 without any context and just sort of think, oh, I'm going to do my best to interpret it. There's a larger context. So I've got an outline that some of you have in your possession, and this is something that I have put together. And I've talked a little bit about chiastic structure in the past. A chiastic structure is a structure that builds an argument towards the center. And so the center point, the middle of the argument, is where the crux of the argument is, and then it has supporting features that parallel each other on either side. Okay? So as we go through, I just wanted to show you that this structure that Matthew has put together about Jesus' argument and how he handles himself during this last week of his life. It is a structure that finds Jesus coming down from the north, from Galilee, which is not a political or religious center of anything. Okay, it's the boondocks. It's way out there. And he's able to do his ministry for the most part up in the Galilee region. But here we find him leaving the safety and comfort of that atmosphere and coming straight into the hornet's nest. Okay, that's the way I like to think about it. And he just doesn't wander into the hornet's nest. What does he do? He really pokes the hive a little bit. Okay? And why would he do that? It's a valid question to ask. Why is it that he is coming to the political and religious center? And why is he poking the hornet's nest like that? Ultimately, it's about the resurrection. Okay? That's what we're going to find out. At the end of this week, what happens? He pokes this thing so hard that all the bees come out, and what do? They end up killing him, right? Okay? And this is by design. He's said it all along. This is what's going to happen. He's told his people. Nobody believes him. But that's why he's coming down. But ultimately, why would he even do that? Because there is a hope that Jesus has that he wants everybody to know about. That hope is the hope of the resurrection. He talks about it back in Matthew 19:28, if you want to look there. He calls it the regeneration, or some translations will have it the renewal of all things. Jesus has this world perspective that the world that we live in is not the world that is to be. This world will go away. Certain factors of it will come through. But in the new regenerated world, it'll be new. When he speaks about people getting into that new world, he speaks in terms of resurrection. And it's his death and his coming back to life that is the sign of the resurrection. The sign, the confidence that there will be a new world. That there will be a reboot. And not just a reboot, but a reconstitution. It's a renewal. The word in Matthew 19:28 is a compound word in the Greek. It literally is Genesis again. What's Genesis? It's the beginning. It's like, in other terms, it's like a birth, right? The birth of the world in Genesis. Genesis is a new birth. Does that sound familiar? Jesus talks in terms of new birth to John, in John chapter 3 to Nicodemus, rather, right? You must be what? Born again. You must be born again. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but as we look at this outline just briefly, I just wanted to set that expectation is Jesus is leaving the safety of his ministry for however long it was, and he is coming down for the last week, and he's going right into the hornet's nest, and he's agitating it We live on 5 acres. Every year when I go out and mow with my tractor, I inevitably come across a in-ground hornet's nest. And I do big circles, so by the time I go by it the first time, I've just agitated them, and then I keep going, right? And I don't even know what's happened. When do I find out? The next time I come around, unbeknownst to me, you'd think I'd learn. This has happened like 5 or 6 times, to the point now that when I hear a bee, I get a little skittish, okay? So, yeah, just know that about me. Jesus is diving right into the middle. He knows what he's doing. He's agitating, and this outline that I'm proposing we take a look at is Matthew's strategic and formulated way that Jesus does this, okay? And we're hopping right into the middle of it in 22. So if we were looking at that, we see in chapter 21 that we've already covered, those 2 sermons that I did, where he enters into Jerusalem. He agitates the hornet's nest by doing first. He enters Jerusalem like a king. And then what does he do? He goes straight up to the temple and he agitates the hornet's nest a little bit, right? And that brings out a question and a challenge by the chief priests and elders. By what authority are you doing this, right? And then Jesus presents them a question. I don't know if you remember that. It's the question about John's baptism. Was it from God or not? And what's their response? We don't know. We don't want to answer that. So he presents them a question that they don't answer. And then he does tell them, even though he says, I'm not going to answer your question, but then he does answer it, and he answers it in 3 parables. What authority do I have? Let me tell you 3 parables, and I'll explain the authority I have. And it's really all about you, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees. So he silences, or he accuses the silent in those 3 parables. Who are the silent? The people that aren't answering the question, right? They posed. And then that leads, those 3 parables lead to 3 questions, and that's part of our tonight, right? We get the last parable and the 3 questions that they ask. Pharisees, Sadducees, and a Pharisaic lawyer. And then it ends with Jesus presenting a question that the leaders, what? Can't answer. Do you remember that? Okay, this is the lesson we're in. And then there's no more challenges by the leadership. So if you just look at that structure, and then he goes on, what we haven't gotten to is chapter 23, 24, and 25, where he just pokes the beehive, not by doing, but by saying, okay? And we'll get into that. So if you look at that structure, he's disrupting, he's challenged, and then there's no more challenges. But the crux, the middle portion, are the 3 parables and these 3 questions. And I'm proposing that Jesus is accusing the silent, those that won't answer him, in the 3 parables, and then he silences his accusers by answering their questions that they think are they think, we've got him. There's no way, right? Okay, so with that, we are diving into parable number 3, the parable of the marriage. So just without even knowing anything about the parable of the marriage feast, knowing this structure, who's it going to be about, or who's it going to entail? Jesus is answering what question? By what authority do you have? And he's challenging the religious leaders' authority in these 3 parables. So the religious leaders are going to be in this parable. There's going to be some relationship that Jesus has to these leaders that shows his authority and their lack of authority, right? That's the expectation that comes out of the outline. Let's see if that's true. So, we're diving into chapter 22, verse 1, the parable of the marriage feast. This first half, one half of this parable is a history lesson, and the other half is a foretelling of future events. That's how I will present it. A couple different ways people look at this. You're welcome to have your opinions. This is the way I'm going to present it because it makes the most sense to me. But these characters, we went through, one of our questions on our lesson was the list of characters and who did they represent. And you can come up with a lot of different possible answers, right? I'll give you mine. Okay, there's a king mentioned. Let's get back to this. I have actually the characters highlighted in purple. There's a king mentioned, verse 2, right? Who's the king? I'm saying it's God the Father, okay? Old Testament understanding, yeah. He gave a wedding feast for his son. Another character, who's the son? Is easy. Jesus, yeah, love, Bible, Jesus, yep. And he sent out his slaves. Yeah, if the first half of this parable is a history lesson, so the slaves are probably the messengers of God in the Old Testament. Took a number of different forms. We can say the prophets, the judges, different people that went out and gave the message of God to the world or to his covenant people. Slaves, those who have been invited in verse 4. Well, if this is a history lesson and the first half is in the past, those who have been invited are those who invited into the old covenant, under the old covenant. Okay, so that would be the nation of Israel, not specifically only the nation of Israel, because there were ways that other people outside the nation were able to come in. So, but in general terms, we'll just say the nation of Israel in the old covenant. Okay. Who else? Well, I used to teach literature, so I'm okay with saying the city is a character. I think that's okay to say. Oftentimes in the Bible, cities are personified. They're given human-like characteristics. So here's a city, though, full of murderers that's destroyed. We're slipping into the futuristic, in my estimation, we're slipping into the futuristic portion of this parable. So up until this point, the seizing of these messengers, these slaves, and the killing of them has happened all along in the past. And at some point, God the Father is going to be angry enough that he will send an army to the city where these people reside and burn it down. That did happen with the nation of Babylon coming in and taking Israel out in the Old Testament, but it will happen again in the future to them. Their future, our past. In AD 70, right? When Rome, the Roman army, came in and burned Jerusalem to the ground and destroyed them. Okay? So, who else is in this parable? 9, as many as you find. The people that go out and invite, right? As many as you. Who are these people? The new dinner guests. Who are they? Well, it's Jew. I will say, politically, it's politically correct. It's Jews and Gentiles. It's the way that the New Testament church is described. So it's not that we've gotten rid of the Jews. Okay, that's some people's presentation. The New Testament church is Jews and Gentiles. I mean, when Jesus, at the end of Matthew, Jesus says, go make disciples. And he says, start in Judea. Start right here. Because there's people that know me here, right? And then there's this interesting character at the end in verse 11. A man who is not dressed in wedding clothes, right? Seems like a poor character. I mean, he just shows up and he's happy to be there, and right? And what happens to him? He gets booted out into eternal darkness, right? Seems like a bit of an overreaction, possibly. But let's consider, this is not just a wedding like we might go to a wedding. This is a wedding of a king. Number one, to refuse an invitation, it's not really an invitation like, I might go, I might not. It's like a command, right? Think of a king's wedding. And there's an expectation in this culture that if you go to a wedding, you wear the appropriate attire. And everybody knows that. So what may seem like an overreaction from our cultural perspective, let's talk about this guy that shows up in different clothing. What's his attitude? Is he from another culture and doesn't understand? No. He understands the cultural expectation, but what does he do with that cultural expectation? He shows up anyway, not just to any wedding, but whose wedding? The king's invitation. He shows up. knowing the cultural expectation of what you're supposed to wear, and what is he wearing? Not the appropriate clothing, right? I would suggest to you that there's a little bit of an attitude that this character has that kind of counterbalances the response that the king gives. That might seem like an overreaction in the first reading. There is an expectation that he is thumbing his nose at. And as we go through, there's a couple things I want to point out. So I've already kind of pointed out that the first half of the parable, probably more like a history lesson. Hey, I'm God, I've sent many prophets to you, Old Testament Israel, Old Covenant Israel, and you killed them. This has been a pattern for a long time. I've invited you to a relationship with me, right? This wedding feast, and you've refused to come. You've got all your excuses, right? And then we get to the response. So this response about this army coming and burning the city. We're slipping into the future, the way I'm reading it, into 70 AD. And then we've got, interestingly in verse 12, there's a couple things in verse 12 that I want to point out. He says to him, about this man who's not dressed in wedding clothes, he says to him, friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes? And then it says the man was speechless. Did you notice what Jesus says, how the king addresses him? What's the term? Friend. Are there any other translations that you might have that is different than friend?
Mine says or invited.
What's that?
It says or invited.
The invited, okay. Invited person, right, okay. So our English word friend is used quite often in the New Testament, and sometimes it's a different Greek word that really means friend, like you're my brother friend, right? This is more like a companion. And interestingly enough, this word for friend, it's translated friend every single time, but it's only used 3 times in the New Testament. It's only used in the book of Matthew. And let me point out to you the 3 different uses where this particular word for friend or companion is used. First is back in chapter 20, verse 13. I'll pull it up on the screen. And if you remember, this is a parable about the laborers in the vineyard. Do you remember? Laborers hired at 6 a.m. all throughout the day. At the end of the day, what happens? They all get paid the same amount. And what happens with those people at the beginning, when they come up to get paid, their expectation is, ooh, this is a real payday, even though I agreed to, I'm going to get. Well, down here in verse 13, it says, but he answered, this is the vineyard owner, and said to one of them, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a certain pay? Interesting use of friend, isn't it? A disgruntled worker. Okay. The other, and then we go to here, chapter 22, verse 12. Friend, how did you come in with wedding clothes? Anybody recall the last one? It's in chapter 26. It's when Judas comes into the Garden of Gethsemane and kisses Jesus and identifies him as the one that the guards want to arrest. And Jesus says what to him? Friend, do what you have come for. So, it's translated as friend, but I think we want to keep this in the perspective that the original context has. I've got one source that I thought worded it well. The meaning is friend, but in each case, each of these 3 cases, it carries an implication of a distinct relationship that 2 people have, where one side is being extremely generous, and the other one is taking or abusing that generosity. Right? They're assuming that generosity should mean more for them. Right? So, I thought that was interesting, verse 12. And then there's this last part of verse 12. The man was speechless. You would think that this guy would have an answer. He knows the question's going to come. He knows he's showing up to a party, right? Where there's an expectation of a certain dress code, and he knows he's not wearing that. He knows he's eventually going to be noticed. You would think he would be playing in his head the multiple responses of how he could respond. But how does he respond? He is speechless. He has nothing to say. He can't respond. Why am I pointing this out? Remember the outline. We've got 3 parables where Jesus accuses the silent, the people that can't answer his questions, right? Then they start asking him questions. We're going out of a series of 3 parables. We're going straight into, and this is the meat of this structure, we're going straight into 3 questions where they're trying to trap him. And the response of every single one of the leaders coming out of each question is a response of silence. And in fact, in verse 34, I'll pop down there really quick. It says, but when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had, what? Silenced the Sadducees. That is the exact same Greek word that is used in the parable of the man wearing the inappropriate clothing at the wedding who was silent. He was speechless. Exact same. Is that by chance that Matthew included? Not by chance. So what is Matthew trying to do in this 3 question section? He's trying to equate the people asking these questions that don't have a response at the end to Jesus' question. He's equating them to who? The guy at the wedding wearing the wrong clothing, because he was speechless too. See that? Who else is tossed in there? Who else is called friend? It's not just the religious leaders, it's one of his own. It's Judas. It's Judas who is called friend. So there are people within and people without that fit this description of who gets in, who gets out, who's wearing the right clothing, who's not. Question number 1. Is in question number 1 is a political question, right? It's about tribute to Caesar. And many of you don't know, but I have many hidden talents. At one time in my life, I was an actor. Actually, I was a soloist. I was on stage and I sang songs. It was only once, and it was in high school. I didn't say professional because I did not get paid. That's important. The one musical that I was in was Fiddler on the Roof. Anybody know? Yes. I played the part of Perchik, the radical, who was a religious radical and he was a political radical. And in that play, or that musical, the character Perchik eyes one of Tevia's daughters and decides to propose. And I looked up my script because I had forgotten the lines, but it's interesting. Her name was Hoddle, and he says, Hoddle, there's a question I wish to discuss with you. And her response is, yes. And my character says, it's a political question. And she says, what is it? And I said, it's the question of marriage. And she said, this is a political question? Right? And I said, well, yes. Yes, everything's political if you look at it from a certain, right? And my character went on to explain how I'm viewing this as a political, social, economic situation, relationship that everybody has value, right? And she gets down to the end and she says, I think you're asking me to marry you. And I said, well, in a theoretical sense, yes, I am. And she said, I was hoping you were. And she agreed. Now, what you don't know is sometimes life is as strange as fiction. And when it came time for me to propose to my wife, to my girlfriend at the time, I felt so enveloped by this Perchek character that I copied the script, printed out 2 copies. I changed the names, so Perchek was now Greg, and Hodel was now Lisa. And I changed Kiev, the location to Tacoma, where we were traveling to. And I stopped at a perfect location, and I pulled out this script, and I handed her part. I wanted to make sure that she said yes. And I figured if there was a script. And I read through it, and we got to the end, and she said yes. She said that it was super easy. So that actually happened. That actually happened. So, the reason I shared that with you is that character Perchek made a religious question of marriage or a relationship question. What did he make it into? He tried to make it into a political question, right? And I think what the religious leaders are doing here is they're trying to take a political question which really has religious undertones in it. It's really a religious question, even though they're trying to make it sound like a political question. Who do you pay taxes to? If I asked you, for instance, hey, so who are you thinking about voting for in the upcoming election? Whatever election that may be. It could be a political question, but if my intent is to, by your response, listen to you and try and figure out where you are religiously and how your religion plays into your political decisions, it's really not a political question. It's really religious at its base. So they're trying to trap him. What's his answer? Well, it seems like, in one sense, he's upholding the idea of the separation of what? Church and state. Now, he wouldn't have said church, synagogue and state, right? But his answer is, pay to Caesar what's Caesar's, and pay to God what's God's, right? Who is he answering? Who asked the question? The Pharisees. How did the Pharisees get their power? Do you know? Are they in the priestly line necessarily? No. Let me give you this. There was some collusion. There was collusion happening. And the only reason these people are in power is because the Romans have given them that power. So Jesus gives this response. Give to Caesar what's Caesar. Give to God what's God's. He's telling people who are giving to Caesar what's Caesar's, and they're giving to Caesar what's God's as well. And in that way, he silences them. They don't have any response. He gets a second question. And for those of you that have time and go to the links that we provide for extra study, I've included a link by a sermon by a guy named Tim Mackey. He's out of Portland, actually. It's part of the Bible Project. And there's a sermon there that goes into much more detail about what I'm going to explain, but about the second question. He does a phenomenal job. So I'm just giving you a little snippet. The link is there. Go look for it and take time to go through that if you desire to. This second question is from the Sadducees. It is about the resurrection, which is interesting because what we know about the Sadducees, one of the things is they're sad. You see, because why? They don't believe in the resurrection. They believe that at the end of this life, that's just it. And really the important thing in this life is to continue your name, right? In their culture, in their way of thinking, the way you survive is not through a resurrection, it's through passing your name on to future generations. So their question attacks both of those things. One, the resurrection. They're actually proposing a question by saying, look how absurd it would be with this woman who's married all these brothers. In the resurrection, this is in the law, Jesus, right? It's in the law. What kind of a mess would the resurrection be just with this one law, let alone all the other ones? So they really think that they're proposing this situation that's just beyond fixable. And Jesus approaches them and says, you know what, that's really a stupid thing for you to ask. Right, in so many words, you don't understand the scriptures or what the power of God is. And they're attacking, remember, that resurrection, which is the whole reason Jesus has come back to Jerusalem. It's that resurrection, that rebirth, that idea of renewal that they're attacking. And they think it's silly and ridiculous. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Torah, the Sadducees. So interestingly, their question comes out of one of the 5 books. Jesus' response comes out of one of the first 5 books. He could have taught about the resurrection out of the prophets or the Psalms, but they didn't hold to those. So he's talking on their turf, at least. That's good. And really their question is about one of their beliefs. How is this woman, or how is this first husband that died going to carry on his name, right? If she marries and marries and marries. And so it's about carrying on the name, which is core to their belief. And Jesus says it's not going to be the same as it is now. And the way he says it is, we will be like angels. And I want you to hear that, like angels, because in our culture, we've got this, it's a wonderful life theory that when you die, you become an angel, right? And that's one of my favorite movies of all time, but the theology of it is horrible, right? And every time a bell rings and things like that. So he doesn't say we become angels. Correct that right now. He says we're like angels in one aspect. And he says that we don't observe marriage in the afterlife the way we do and understand it now. Okay? And I want to take a look at this because this is troubling for some, especially when I was younger and single. I read this and I was like, well, I hope he doesn't come back right away because I want to get married first and I want to have, right? I mean, that's a common response, I think. But let me try and explain, given this birth narrative, this idea of rebirth, this you must be born again, the renewal of the world. By taking you back to your birth. You were all there, weren't you? You don't remember it, but you've seen pictures of what happens inside the womb, right? We've all seen the charts of different weeks and how things grow in the womb and how they're formed. And that was an existence that every single one of us went through. And I want you to think about this for a long period of time. All of us had lungs and we didn't breathe air. But what was in our lungs? We went through the motion of breathing, but it wasn't air coming in and out. What was it? It was fluid, right? We had fluid in our lungs for a long period of time. What would happen if we try and do that now? You got problems, right? So, and it wasn't even the way we think of it now about oxygen, right? Because that's our source of oxygen now. Where were we getting our oxygen from? And food. Through a little cord, right? If we were able to get inside the womb and interview a fetus, interview you before you were born, and ask you questions about life, you would have a terribly different experience and answers than we do now, right? You would say, I've got this warm fluid all in and through, I've got this umbilical cord, this is my life source, right? Everything I know, and growth. And if I were to ask you the question in the womb as a fetus, what do you think about pizza? Because pizza is phenomenal, right? I mean, pizza's great. What would your response be? What? Well, there's this, it's pizza, it's round, and you eat it, and you put it into your mouth, and you eat it, and you... What? What? I have no idea what it is, what reality it is that you're talking about. And in a very short instance, in one very short time span, what happens to this fetus? Lungs, all the fluid goes out of the lungs, right? And what comes in? Air comes in for the first time, and the lungs actually are starting to be used. They were there all along, but they're now starting to be used for what they were originally intended and created for. Right? Totally foreign, so foreign that babies cry because of the shock and the pain that they're going through, right? Of this new reality. What happened to the cord? It's like gone. It's like gone, and they pinch it off and they sew it up, and it's like... And now I'm getting sustenance through my mouth. This is so weird. Don't even know what pizza is still, but I think I understand mouth, right? Okay? This is what happens in a birth scenario, where there's three things that happen. Some things that are there before, from the old existence, remain like lungs, but then they're used for their full potential. What happened before, they were being used, they were being developed, but now in the new existence, it's the full potential of those things that remain. Some things don't remain, though, like the umbilical cord. That's just gone. Marriage is like that. It's just gone. Something that we think is so vital to our existence here, gone. And then there are some things that are just brand new, like a love for pizza. Didn't exist before, it's brand new, right? And as we come into this discussion, Jesus is saying you're viewing marriage all wrong. You're viewing marriage like it's something that's supposed to survive the grave, but really all marriage is a picture that gives us an insight into who God is and our relationship with God. And let me just propose this to you, and hopefully this will make sense. When we enter into a relationship in marriage, the way God defined marriage, a man and a woman, two different entities coming together saying, I'm going to forgo everyone else that I have an option with, and I'm going to enter into covenant relationship with you, two different entities. When that happens, there is a new creation that is birthed out of that relationship, that covenant relationship. So the picture of two different entities coming together and creating a new creation, having a new birth come out of that, a new creation come out of that, is a picture here on earth of our relationship with God. New Testament language now. The church is the bride of Christ. We have the different entities, Christ and the bride, that come together into covenant relationship. And what is birthed out of that covenant relationship? It's not a new baby. It's a new me. I am birthed anew. John chapter 3. Nicodemus, don't you know you must be reborn through covenant relationship with God to enter into the kingdom of heaven? This new creation, this new renewal of the world. Does that make sense? This is the answer that Jesus is giving to the Sadducees who don't even believe in the resurrection. And Jesus is saying, this is all that it's about. This is why I'm here. It's the renewal, it's the resurrection, it's this picture of marriage that doesn't survive this world because there is something else in the next world. So there were three entities. The lungs existed before, but they find their full potential. This last question, we're almost done, but this last question, what's the greatest commandment? They think they're going to get him. And the answer Jesus gives is what? Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as much as you like yourself. Right? And so, love is one of those things that exists before. It's like lungs. It exists before the new birth, and then it also exists on the other side, but it reaches its full potential in the regeneration. My ability to love is very limited. All of ours is. Here. Marriage, I love my wife, I love my kids, I love my family. I am able to love a few people around me that I rub shoulders with. But beyond that, let's be honest. I don't have the time or the energy, or maybe that's an excuse, but it seems like at times that's all I've got. I cannot love everyone. I cannot love everyone with a fully developed love. So this side, God says, let's practice. Love your God and love those around you as best you can, the way God teaches you. But think about this. In the renewal, in the resurrection, when the world is renewed, the boundaries of my marriage to Lisa are erased. Why? Not because I'm not going to love her anymore, but because I will have the ability to love everybody with a fully developed love. Think about that. Is that inviting? We get to practice what Jesus says. We're born anew here, and we get to practice that love in little bits and pieces to show the world a preview of what's to come. Love survives, and it's going to be more beautiful and unimaginable. It's going to be like breathing air to a fetus. I can't even imagine. I don't have words. I don't have a paradigm for it. It's what the love is going to be. No boundaries. Jesus ends with a question that they can't answer. And if you remember, that's where we started. They ask questions that Jesus fully answers. And Jesus asks questions that they cannot answer. And in so doing, they are silenced. And how does this end? No one was able to answer him a word, verse 46. Nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. In other words, the dialogue has ended. We're not trying to do this way anymore. And we find out later that they try another way, right? Okay, we're not trying to talk this through anymore, in other words. Some good takeaways from this week. Don't be that guy with the wrong clothes on. Don't have the attitude of the guy with the wrong clothes. What are the wrong clothes? Glad you asked, thank you. Chapter 23, Jesus is going to go into the woes. Woe to the hypocrites, the Pharisees and the scribes, because they act like this. And if you remember from chapter 5, way back in the day, we went to chapter 23 because the blessings were in chapter 5 and the curses were in 23, the same as the two mountains of the blessings and curses in the Old Testament. We're now at the curses. And if you want to know what the wrong clothing is from a spiritual sense, read chapter 23. We'll cover it next week. Do all that stuff. And you will be wearing the wrong clothing. But if you want to wear the right clothing, where do you go? Go back to chapter 5 and say, blessed is who? Well, there's a whole list of clothing that you can put on there that's the right clothing. Right? So, that picture of renewal, I'm not sure that I'm going to view it the same again. If I'm understanding what Jesus is doing here, that I will be able to experience intimacy and love even better than I do with my current wife, because it will be fully developed. And I will be able to share that, not in a sexual way, but in an intimate way, with God and with my neighbor in the renewal, in the rebirth. But how do I practice that here? Good questions. And remember, who's your neighbor? It's not just the people you like. But Jesus answers that question, who's my neighbor? And it says it's the people, it's your enemies. It's the people you can't stand. So just start making a list, and there's your homework, okay? Dear God, thanks for a chance to come together tonight, be challenged by your word. Thanks for the summer break that we've had and the chance to get back into and be challenged by, on a daily basis, the words that you have for us. God, you have a resurrection and a renewal of this earth that we often don't understand, and we don't even have words for it. We don't have a paradigm to think about it. But God, we understand it's going to be good. We look forward to that. And in the meantime, teach us, challenge us, test us with your love. In Jesus' name, amen.